games involving kicking were very common in many ancient and medieval societies, each with its own styles and rules. In medieval Europe, playing with a ball was mentioned from the 9th century by the Welsh monk Nennius, but with no further details. The game in England that we know as football likely emerged gradually during the Middle Ages, but there are few references to it from that time, and mostly on banning it. Let's find out why. William Fitzstephen in 1174 illustrates how little we know about medieval football. In his biography of Thomas Becket, Fitzstephen included a short work known as Descriptio Nobilissimi Civitatis Londoniae, which describes life in the city of London. And he says that, after lunch, the entire youth of the day goes to the fields for the famous game of ball, pilla in Latin. The students of the several branches of study have their ball, the followers of the several trades of the city have a ball in their hands. The elders, the fathers, and men of wealth come on horseback to view the contests of their juniors, and in their fashion sport with the young men, and there seems to be aroused in them, in the elders, a stirring of natural heat by viewing so much activity and by participation in the joys of unrestrained youth, liberioris in Latin. This game was being played at Shrovetide, a few days just before the start of Lent. Throughout history, football and Shrovetide seem to have been linked together, suggesting that this was an early example of that tradition. Villagers could compete with one another, frequently ending in a mass brawl with injuries. A misadventure arising from such a ball game is reported from Newcastle upon Tyne on September the 15th in 1280 during the reign of Edward I. Henry, son of William the Ellington, while playing at ball, ludens ad pilum, at Oakham on Trinity Sunday with David Lequeux and many others, ran against David and received an accidental wound from David's knife, of which he died the following Friday. They were both running to the ball and ran against each other, and the knife, hanging from David's belt, stuck out so that the point through the sheath struck against Henry's belly and the handle against David's belly. Henry was wounded right through the sheath and died by misadventure. This is similar to another case, a dispensation granted by Pope John XXII from Avignon in May in 1321. To William the Spalding, Canon of Shuldham, Norfolk, of the Gibbertine Order of Sempringham. During a game at ball, ad pillam, again in Latin, as he kicked the ball, cum pede, so by foot, a lay friend of his, also called William, ran against him and wounded himself on the sheathed knife carried by the canon, so severely that he died within 6 days. The game here is very clearly a game of considerable violence and was indulged in by a group of players. Furthermore, we are certain that football was being played only a few decades later, when it had already become quite the public nuisance in London. Many of the references to medieval football actually come from authorities attempting to stop the game. Royal and local governments often found that the game led to violence or was considered too frivolous. For example, in 1314, the City of London banned the game, stating the following in a proclamation issued for the preservation of the peace. By virtue of this notice, Nicholas de Fandon, then mayor, has, by trustworthy men of the several wards of London, caused inquiry to be made concerning malefactors and night prowlers, and has caused the proclamation set forth below as follows to be proclaimed throughout the entire city. Whereas our Lord the King is going towards the parts of Scotland in his war against his enemies, and has especially commanded us strictly to keep his peace, and whereas there is a great uproar in the city through certain tumults arising from the striking of great footballs in the fields of the public, from which many evils perchance may arise, which may God forbid, we do command and we do forbid on the King's behalf, upon pain of imprisonment, that such a game should not be practiced henceforth within the city. So the game, seemingly also played by university students, or at least something similar, was a game of violence often tending to cause breaches of the peace, and it is placed under the ban of official disapproval. We should also notice the implication that it would have been a common enough affair as it was not presented as an out-of-the-ordinary activity. In 1364, during Edward III, the Synod of Ely pronounced against the participation of the clergy in secular games in general, and a year later, as a measure of national defense, football is specifically banned. The statute in question is dated to June 12, 1365. ordered to cause proclamation to be made that every able-bodied man of the said city on feast days, when he has leisure, shall in his sport use bows and arrows or pellets and bolts, forbidding them under pain of imprisonment to meddle in the hurling of stones, handball, football, pilampedium, or other vain games of no value. It is evident that through the reign of Edward III, among peasantry, artisans and apprentices, football was gaining in popularity to an extent to interfere with the practice of archery, still essential to the defense of the realm. The suppression of football, among other sports, in order to encourage archery, appears here for the first time, but from now on, both in England and later in Scotland, this becomes the leading motive behind anti-football legislation. There are also allusions in literature, in the works of Chaucer, in A Knight's Tale and Dryden, with rolling along a football to your foes used as a metaphor in a combat scene with deadly consequences. The matches in which these mishaps occurred may well have been played in the yard of the church, in which the baptisms took place. As early as 1287, in the Synod of Exeter, it has been necessary to regulate the indulging in sports in churchyards. A book called Instructions for Parish Priests adds bowling and, more specifically, handball and football to the activities which should be limited. In the 15th century, however, we have evidence that players and fans started organizing in fraternities. The Brewers' Company of London listed dues that had to be paid within 2 years by different crafts, among them footballers, indicating that the activity was recognized and perhaps even organized in some formal capacity at the time. Football also makes its appearance in morality plays, such as Mankind from the reign of Edward IV. It continued to be popular and regarded with suspicion, as well as legislated against, in the borough of Leicester, for example, again under pain of imprisonment. It was reported that the high price of bows was discouraging shooting and that the people were resorting to games forbidden by law. From the records and allusions available, it is quite impossible to reconstruct the rules and techniques which may have governed medieval football, and indeed it may be reasonably doubted if such existed. One should rather imagine a rough and formless game played by an indefinite number of players struggling to gain possession of a ball and to carry it to a point which we would call the goal. The game gradually evolved to be played only by foot. But in a book about the miracles performed by Henry VI, we do catch a glimpse of the overall image, although the source may draw on previous ones reflecting the opinions of high society about the pleasantries of peasants. Common recreation is called by some the football game. It is one in which young men in the country sport propel a huge ball not by throwing it into the air but by striking and rolling it along the ground, and that not with their hands but with their feet. A game, I say, abominable enough and, in my judgment at least, more common, undignified and worthless than any other kind. The boundaries had been marked and the game had started, and when they were striving manfully, kicking in opposite directions, and our hero, a certain William, had thrown himself into the midst of the fray, one of his fellows, whose name I know not, came up against him in front and kicked him. If you're wondering what this account is doing in a book of miracles, well, the injured player supposedly recovered after seeing King Henry in a dream. So the efforts to ban football, not only in England but also Scotland or France, came to no avail in the long run. Although the sport most of us know now is hugely codified and organized, the roots of the game lie in a rather chaotic mass participation, entertaining nevertheless for medieval standards at least. Well, at least during modern football, wearing a dagger is prohibited, which, we can consider a progress. This contribution was based especially on an excellent article from 1929 written by Francis Peabody Magoon, Football in Medieval England and in Middle English Literature. Old but gold. Thanks for listening. This was Irina. Subscribe if you liked it, and if you're wondering what similar activities Vikings spend their time with, follow up with an older video I made on the topic about knatleker. Also, if you're watching or attending the Euro, have a whale of a time and try not to get battered or something. Till next time.